All right. Is this on? Yeah. So before I begin, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about anything that I have mentioned or anything that has been covered in the course thus far? Anya?
The film journal includes Babylon on Fire, right?
Sorry?
The film journal, you include Babylon?
No. Did I not mention that in the email? Okay, yeah. Now, you don't have to, I mean, if someone is enjoying the course and enjoying writing it, you can add an entry on the documentary, this documentary, but that's not required. You do have to do an entry for every feature film, but you don't have to do it for this particular film. Yeah, okay? But you're responsible for it, of course. Everything that's on the syllabus, you're responsible for. So you do have to see the film. That I made clear in the syllabus, and I mentioned that as well, but you don't have to do an entry on it. All right? Yeah. Any other questions that anyone else has? All right. So what I want to do is we're going to spend the entire afternoon on the subject of cricket and cinema, and I expect to finish with my discussion today. So we're going to be absolutely on schedule. And I want to remind you that there is an extra class this Saturday. I had pointed that out in an email, and I will send a reminder to you, but it's in Bunch Hall. I think it's room 3112. I can't remember the exact room number. And it's going to be at 10:30 on Saturday, this Saturday. The class, unfortunately, will not be recorded by AVS, although I'm going to try to make a personal arrangement just so that I have the complete set of lectures, you know. But if I'm not able to do that, you're going to have to then, if in case you can't make it, have to get the notes from someone else, you know, for that particular lecture. So I expect to go on till about 12:30, so it'll be a 2-hour class, because we're going to try to get a little bit ahead of schedule, since there's going to be one class in week 9, which is not going to be held. That's the Thursday of week 9, as is mentioned in the syllabus, as I had mentioned to you before. All right. So the agenda for this week, in short, today we finish up with Lagaan, and we finish up with the question of cricket, and then on Thursday we move to the week 6 readings, and Saturday we conclude the week 6. So we're completely caught up at that point. All right. And the week 6 has to do with Bhagat Singh. The film is called Rang De Basanti. There are a number of other films on Bhagat Singh. That same year, in fact, there were actually 3 feature films on Bhagat Singh, and there have been a number of films on him before, so he's an Indian revolutionary. You'll find out more about him when we get to him. Now, before we turn to Bhagat Singh and all of that, for today's class, I want to, as I said, continue to remain focused on the question of Lagaan. And what I want to do is I want to begin with some excerpts from this film. But I want to sort of position this discussion before I venture to show you a few excerpts. When we're thinking about cricket, we're thinking about a game, well, we know what Nandi's interesting formulation is, an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British. But let's take the more straightforward narrative that we have. And that straightforward narrative tells us that this is a game that was brought to India by the British. And of course, the British took it to other parts of their empire. It didn't really catch on in the same way in Africa. So there are these test-playing countries. There are these test-playing countries, and the principal test-playing countries are, of course, England, the mother country, so to speak, and then we have Australia and New Zealand. We have India, and we have Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and we have the West Indies. Okay, right? There's one more country there, I forget which one it is, that I missed out, because there are 8 major test-playing countries. South Africa. All right, and South Africa, incidentally, was banned from international cricket for several decades. This was during the period, of course, when South Africa was under an apartheid regime. So South Africa was banned from international sports competitions, not just from cricket. But think of it this way: we know that the British had a large number of colonies in Africa. Nigeria and Kenya were both under British rule, but the game never caught on. in Kenya and Nigeria. And if you said that, well, they didn't catch on with black people, well, that wouldn't be correct, because the West Indies, this whole film is about black power, you could say, and cricket, right? So that certainly was not the case, and there are interesting historical questions about why it caught on in some places and didn't elsewhere. But what's the gist of it is, before we get to the particulars of Caribbean cricket, the gist of it is that this was a game of the empire, right? It was a game of the empire, and all the places that were brought under the rubric of cricket were places that had fallen either under British rule or war, and which was of course the case as well in Australia and New Zealand as well, but they had a different status because these were white dominions as opposed to countries such as India. Now, before I explicate some features of this film, let me begin by trying to draw you into the discussion on the assumption that you've all seen the film. What might be a couple of things that strike you about this film? Or let me put it to you this way. Let's supposing that you had to do a critique. It's a very compelling film. And I think for those of you who know a little bit about my politics, from what I've said in the last 5 weeks, you know that it's a film that would find much sympathy, right, in someone like me. I would look at it very favorably, given my strong anti-colonial tendencies. However, I have a very critical perspective. A very critical perspective on this film. I think it's still a very compelling film, but there are a lot of problems in it. What might be, you think, a problem or two? Please jump into it. Throw me a fast ball. Maybe it won't hit the wicket, but try. You know? Take a risk. What might be a possible critique? Let's supposing I gave you a question on the exam that we have been considering. So the exam question could be framed this way. You're not going to get this question now, but this is the kind of question you could get on the exam, right? So let's supposing the question was that it can be argued that there is an explicit relationship between cricket, race, and nationalism, right? How would you use Lagaan and Babylon in Fire to articulate some aspects of this relationship? All right, let me give you a clue. Let me ask you a different question. Yes, Anya, you had your hand up?
I think I was just, I might be completely off base here.
Yeah.
But I was thinking maybe it's using the game of the colonizer against the colonizer.
Okay, that's a possible, but I'd have to hear a lot more. I know where you're going with that one, and I would say that that's a reading that is Anya's submission here is that it's using very much the language of the colonizer in many ways to critique the colonizer. And then of course the question becomes, if I may use the phrase of Audre Lorde, right, the black feminist poet, that you cannot use the master's tools to deconstruct the master's house. That is, that you cannot use the colonizer's own language to try to deconstruct the colonizer. That would be the... But before we get into that, let me ask you this. If you had to demographically describe the Caribbean, how would you describe the British Caribbean? What the British Caribbean is, you know what the British Caribbean is, right? I mean so there's a team called the West Indies. And the West Indies team is actually comprised of cricketers from 15 different countries. But these are all very small countries. And it includes Guyana, which is not actually, strictly speaking, in the Caribbean, because Guyana, for those of you who know your geography, is in South America. It's the topmost edge of South America, bordering Venezuela. All right? Okay, and then you have got countries such as Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua. All right? Now so what is the demographic composition of the Caribbean? Yes?
It's multiple. Black,
Yeah?
Indian, and white.
Okay. Well, white is very small.
And Indian.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, black and
What we
Indian.
call Native American, but
Yeah, but that's very small too. The Caribs, who are the indigenous people of the Caribbean, they're called the Caribs. They were virtually all wiped out. Virtually. I mean, what you had there is what you had in large parts of North America and South America, genocide. There's no other word for it. Okay? They were virtually eliminated. You have Maroons, these are runaway slave communities, but those are very different. And then you have a Creole population, and you have a mixed population, but in Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, all of these places, it's very small. It's relatively small. You have a very small number of Chinese who were brought there for the same reason that the Indians were. So now I'm starting to get into the demographic composition. I'm surprised that nobody's mentioned this, but Trinidad, until 25 years ago, had a larger share of Indians than any other group in the Caribbean. And even today, the population of Trinidad is divided between Indo-Trinidadians and Afro-Trinidadians. They constitute about the same percentage of the population. The only reason why the Indian population has gone down a little bit in the Caribbean is because of outward migration. So if there's anyone here from the East Coast, and if you've ever spent time in New York, you would immediately know that there's a huge number of Indo-Trinidadians and Indo-Guyanese in New York. 300,000. Okay? Guyana, which is another country that supplies cricketers to the West Indies team, has a majority Indian population. All right? Now, I'm not going to get into the entire history of how that happened. This has to do with 19th century indentured labor, briefly. So because once you had the abolition of slavery, the abolition of slavery itself was in two parts, if I may put it this way. So first there was the abolition of trafficking, the slave trade, which is different than the abolition of slavery. The two are not the same things. So the British abolished the slave trade in their possessions in 1808, which means that no longer were they going to transport slaves to the New World, right? They were not going to do it. And of course, you know that slaves continued to come to the United States, but the United States was not a British possession at that point. It was an independent country in 1808. And then the second step was the abolition of slavery altogether. That is, that people who were still working as slaves on these plantations, they were now free. All right? Now, what was the problem? The problem was that in places like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, I'm giving you 5 places. Okay? In these places, all of which had a large slave population which was now free, the problem was that plantation owners, what is the major crop there? What's the major contribution of the Caribbean? Sugar. And what's the alcoholic drink? Rum. Right? In these sugar plantations, the problem for the plantation owners, who were all Europeans, were now they suddenly had a problem of labor. Because if the slaves have been freed, who is going to do the work? And you could say, well, of course, it was the former slaves. The problem was that they put a price on their labor which plantation owners were not willing to pay. I'm just giving you the short version of the story. And therefore, what the British did was they imported a large number of Indians. India was a British colony. These plantation owners in places like Barbados and Jamaica and Trinidad, they were all well connected with the elites, of course, back in England, and with the British elites in India. And they used, of course, their government networks and circles, and they were able to get a large number of Indians to come to the Caribbean, which is why you have a substantial number of Indians all over the British Caribbean, not the Spanish Caribbean. So that's why you do not find Indians, for example, except a few here and there in places like Haiti or the Dominican Republic or Cuba. But you find them in the British Caribbean. Now, here's the first critique. where the hell are the Indians? This whole film has been made and you wouldn't know that there was a single Indian in the Caribbean. Did you think about that? Right? You can't think about it if you don't know what the Caribbean is. That Trinidad has 45% Indians, 45%. Guyana has 50% of the population is of Indian origin. Where are the Indians? There were Indians who were prominent in the West Indies cricket team. The most well-known example was a man by the name of Rohan Kanhai. And by the way, when I was in India, growing up in India, and the West Indies cricket team used to come and play in India, we were always looking to see how the Indians were doing on the West Indian cricket team. And Kanhai was a great master batsman. He was a fantastic stylist. He played with extraordinary charm and poise and style. And if you talk to, he's from Guyana, he's from Berbice. I've been to his hometown in Guyana. And if you talk to people in Guyana of my generation or even older than me, they all remember two Indians. One was Kanhai, and the other was an Indian politician who became the most well-known politician in Guyana, Chedi Jagan. Okay? These were the great heroes. However, when you watch this film, there isn't a trace of that at all. You would come away with the impression, number one, that the Caribbean is overwhelmingly black, right? And that defines the identity of the Caribbean. Right? And you would walk away, number two, with the impression, which is a corollary of one, really, but more specific to our interests, namely that the West Indian cricket team was always a black team, and which is strictly inaccurate. And this is where we get to critique number two of this film. Thus far, I've been trying to suggest to you, okay, in order to understand critique number two, think of it this way. Thus far, I've been trying to suggest to you, and the readings that have been given to you, particularly the reading by Ashish Nandi, The Tao of Cricket, have suggested to you that cricket is an open-ended game. And this is a game that relishes in all kinds of ambiguities. It has also been argued, both by Nandi, and I have suggested that as well, and I think it's transparent even in Lagaan in many ways, that there was always a kind of an ambivalence in cricket about the question of gender. So, for example, we know that this was a game in India, originally in India, it was a game of the princes, of the elites. The princes themselves, by the way, were viewed both as masculine and feminine by the British. One of the reasons they were viewed as feminine was they had too much of a fondness for jewelry. Lagaan, if you have noticed the Indian Maharaja, he's always decked in jewelry. And there is this very touching scene when he's watching the match and the Indians are playing so well. You know what the Maharajas used to do? If they got very pleased with somebody, they would take off their necklace and throw it to him. Here's my gift to you. He's about to do that, and then of course he remembers, I've got this British official sitting next to me, he's going to know that I'm favoring the Indians, you know. And so then he restrains himself. I don't know how many of you remember that scene. It's very explicitly done, right? And so one of the times when the Maharaja would always take off his necklace as a gesture of his appreciation was when a courtesan would dance before him and he enjoyed the dance, and then he would take off the necklace and throw it to her. All right? Now, you see, so that was, the Indian Maharaja was effeminate. He displayed too many womanly characteristics. On the other hand, at least he went hunting, so that made him something of a man. These were manly sports, right? And he rode on a horse, so forth and so on. I can't get into all the permutations of this, but you understand what I'm saying is that he was a figure of both masculinity in some ways and femininity. And cricket itself is a game that has a certain kind of, I'm describing ambivalence about the question of gender. So, for example, in comparison to football, which is a working class game and deeply steeped in the ethos of alcohol. Right? I mean, if you go to a football game in Britain today, you go there partially with the purpose of making sure that you're going to have 12 bottles of beer and then you're going to throw up at some point. Right? That's part of the ritual, almost, it seems. Right? I mean, it's a big, gigantic fraternity, Animal House. That's what it is. You know, an English football game at some level. Now, cricket, on the other hand, has all these rituals which were viewed as being soft, effeminate. You know, a fast bowler wearing a half-sleeve sweater. You know, who wears a half-sleeve sweater except an English gentleman, you know? Right? That was sort of the like, and you know, then having finger sandwiches, you know, for tea in between the game. So this was all considered to be very unmanly in a way by some people, and yet it was part of the ethos of cricket. So here's critique number 2. This film shows a kind of a rough and raw masculinity to Caribbean cricket. And of course we understand why it does so, but there must be some degree of self-reflexivity in the filmmaker when he or she is doing it. Why is it doing it? Because this is not a film, let us be very clear, it is not a film about the history of West Indian cricket or Caribbean cricket for 60 years. It's a history of Caribbean cricket from about 1980 to 1995, when the West Indian cricket team was completely dominant. And if you watch the film, you know that a couple of the players will tell you that this is the only team in any professional sports, whether it's basketball, hockey, football, cricket, you know, ice hockey, you name it. The only team that for 15 years did not lose a single test series. They lost tests, but not a series. Because when you usually play test cricket, the norm is you have a series. So when England comes on a tour of India even today, or India goes on a tour of Australia, the tour is about 6 weeks, by the way. Okay? And the reason it's 6 weeks is because you might play, let's say, 4 test matches. Right? So that's a series. And then the winner of that series is the winner overall. Right? So West Indies did lose tests in those 15 years, but they never lost a series. And there is no other sport in the world where any team won for 15 years without losing a series. Yes?
In response to the second critique
Yeah.
that you just gave, isn't like modern cricket not feminine at all? I mean, I know like in cricket culture in India, and since Babylon on Fire is also
Yeah.
like sort of the second half of the 20th century. And,
Yeah.
you know, cricket is not feminine anymore, especially like if in India you say to someone that cricket is not an entirely masculine game, that itself would be an offensive thing to say.
Well, the difficulty is that cricket has become increasingly professionalized and masculinized. It was really a game of amateurs, which is why if you read the Nandi reading, you would notice, for example, that some of the pages that were assigned to you were pages having to do with Sherlock Holmes. You say, what does that have to do with cricket? Well, it has everything to do with cricket. Because what he's trying to suggest is that there is a difference between amateurs and professionals. Okay? And that in some ways, the English ethos, the English had that sense. But then gradually they're going to lose that as well. And partially they're going to lose it because you have an increasing Americanization of the word, frankly. And Americanization always means professionalization and masculinization. That's what happened to cricket. So cricket basically is going to enter into the global economic marketplace. That's what Packer did. Packer is mentioned in this documentary. So he's the person, he's the Australian, all right? It couldn't be an American here as per se because the Americans didn't play cricket, right? It was an Australian who basically said that, well, I'm going to introduce this fast-paced version of cricket.
All right? So the answer to your question, in short, although one can explicate it at much greater length, is that there is an increasing masculinization throughout in many respects, but cricket has still retained something of that kind of ambivalence in some ways. The leisurely pace itself, for example, does not go well in the economic marketplace in many respects. All right? But what strikes me here is that there is a kind of an aggressive, raw masculinity which is linked up with cricket. And once you do that, you begin to lose in some way some of the nuances of cricket, which is another reason why, if you've seen the film, you understand that what the West Indies cricket team was trying to do was they were trying to now introduce pace bowlers, fast bowlers. But of course, for those of you who play cricket, and even if you don't, if you've seen Lagaan, you know that they're essentially, I mean, if I may just make a rough distinction, there are two kinds of pitches that you can have. You can have either the fast or you can have spin bowling. All right? And the Indians who were on the West Indies cricket team, historically speaking, were either great batsmen or they were great spin bowlers. And of course, both of these groups are eviscerated from this particular film, right? So the basis of what I'm suggesting to you is that when you see this film, you get caught up in the narrative. It is a very compelling narrative because this narrative, very broadly speaking, is a narrative about cricket and colonialism. It's a narrative about a game that becomes the game of the empire, and now the West Indies cricket team is going to go out to show that, look, we can play the white man's game better than the white man can play it. You know? Right? That's kind of the refrain that runs through this film. And what I want to do here is I want to begin with a few episodes where we begin to see some of the nuances of this. So let me find the first 7 minutes into the film. Okay.
You are remnants of your ancestors, for sure. It runs in the blood. It is a history of a period that one should never forget.
So this man you're hearing is Viv Richards, who was an extraordinary stylist and batsman and a legendary figure in the game of cricket. All right. So he's part of the West Indian cricket team. This cricket team, 1980 to 95, one of the overlaps, by the way, between Babylon and Fire and Lagaan is that just as Babylon and Fire is about a West Indies cricket team that is assembled, okay, from 15 different countries, right? Mainly island countries that you're really talking about, right? So it creates some kind of unity for the Caribbean. That is, of course, very much the theme of Lagaan itself. You put together these disparate group of people who seem to otherwise have nothing in common. One is a potter, one is a guy who tends to chickens. You remember some of the characters in Lagaan, right? I mean, what do they really have in common? You know. So, but we'll get back to Lagaan. But there's an overlap right there, right? And so, of course, the real question was, well, could West Indies actually put together a cricket team that would succeed? All right. So let's listen to what he has to say for a couple of minutes.
Cricket itself was used as one of the instruments of colonizing and was very much seen as imparting English aristocratic values to discipline this nigger.
Aristocratic values, elite game.
Ex-slaves trying to excel in something which the English masters had brought on.
We have an avenue to accomplish, and that avenue, it's the God-given talent of cricket. It's about showing how equal you are and prove that you are a little bit more useful than they see you.
So that's the kind of fight, that's the kind of struggle, and they know they have something to do with righting that wrong.
It took English society something.
That's Elizabeth and
that African people
the Duke of Edinburgh.
Stripped of something by colonialism and slavery. And this latest generation want to restore a dignity what was taken. This is the age of the major Caribbean territories asserting their independence. Jamaica in 62, Trinidad, Guyana and Barbados in 66. Independence was seen as the high point of a civil rights struggle that had gone on for 100 years.
These are all British colonies. Interesting links between this and the American civil rights movements in some ways.
we started thinking like West Indians and not like Englishmen who were living in the West Indies. We all had ambitions. We wanted to be something to prove that we've emerged from being the slaves. We wanted to show our emergence as a nation.
The existing superstructure has handed out crumbs. We don't want any crumbs, we want the whole loaf now.
This team is really, in fact, a mouthpiece for these transformations, reflecting the confidence of this independence generation. There's no going back. Cricket has to lead the way, and we have to go to the future as fast as we can.
To see someone of your color representing you at that level.
That's a Black Power salute, famous one.
Those guys were heroes, people that
Muhammad Ali.
The struggle. That also was a part of.
So when you think, by the way, of this, when you think of the period that he's talking about, you have to think about the relationship between sports and politics more broadly. Now, it's not simply a question of nationalism, but sports and politics. So when you think about the NFL and the kneeling by some of the players, their protest, and some of the outrage that some conservative Americans have expressed, but there's no reason why sports should not be an arena of political expression as well. And that's exactly what was going on, not simply in Caribbean cricket, but that's what was going on in the 1960s. When you think of Muhammad Ali in boxing, I'm sure that you know the interesting and extraordinary history of Muhammad Ali and his critique of the Vietnam War, and so on. And so that is all part of this history that we're looking at over here,
It started to take that side of consciousness, and I could identify more than anything else the pain which our brothers and sisters would have been through.
So this is a kind of a Pan-Africanism solidarity that is at work over here as well, which is why you get images of Martin Luther King, and the civil rights movement.
To the white world, to balk this racism by defeating it on the field of play, by truly making the cricket field a level playing field.
Okay, all right. And I want to go to a couple more episodes here. So this is 2022. Well, just about a minute or so here. Okay, so let me just explain the context here. This is something that Nandi talks about, and at a different time. So in the late 1920s, early 1930s, you had what was called the body line controversy. So the body line controversy was when the English, and at that point, by the way, the West Indies didn't really have a cricket team. India was still, of course, under colonial rule. So by far the major cricket test teams in the world were obviously England and Australia, and there's a traditional rivalry now between England and Australia. It's called the Ashes. So the body line controversy was a controversy that arose when the English unleashed a fast bowler by the name of Jardine. Jardine, incidentally, grew up in India, so there's an interesting little twist there. An Englishman who had grown up in India and who otherwise off the field had a reputation for being an extraordinary gentleman, but on the field he could be a killer, as it were. So the body line controversy arose when the English, in an attempt to defeat the Australians, unleashed this fast bowler whose strategy was to essentially, to put it very simply, was to sort of throw these fast balls and bouncers which would hit the player on the head often. And if you've seen Lagaan, to that extent, Lagaan is kind of accurate in the sense that many of these players didn't wear any body armor at all. Body armor in cricket is a relatively new thing. Okay, a relatively new thing, just going back to a couple of decades effectively. All right, so that was the body line controversy, and what he's talking about here is the reincarnation of that, because the Australian cricket team has had this slew of fast bowlers, particularly two players by the name of Dennis Lillee and Jeff Thompson. And that's the context that you have over here, because that's when West Indies got blown away by these fast bowlers, and then there was a kind of a moment of reckoning in West Indies cricket that, look, we have to do something, because essentially
our masculinity is at stake too. It's not simply that we are being defeated by these Australians, and I think the loss of a match or a series to the Australians and the English hurt the West Indies emotionally more than anything else, because they saw the Australians and the English as outright racists. So there is a way in which race, obviously looms over the whole story in significant ways. So that's what he's referring to, these chants that the Australian audience would have when Lily would come and they would urge Lily, kill, right? And it is in response to this that the West Indies decided that they were going to now try to cultivate a much harder attitude, and then they cultivated this whole slate of fast bowlers,
There can't be a lot of love going on here.
It is in your face. It wasn't easy walking.
That's Michael Holding, one of the great fast bowlers from that period.
It was a war. Believe me, it was a war.
A war.
And they didn't let up. They threw the kitchen sink, they threw everything at you. They let you know, well, we're in charge and you're not coming on our patch to do well.
Now you can see we've moved a long ways from this whole idea of cricket as a game of amateurs being played by these gentlemen scholars at Oxford and Cambridge in England. Right now here the metaphors are of war. Right? This is like, look, I mean, if racist white Australia and England are going to blow us to smithereens, that we need to sort of get back, and this is one of the means that we have to do so, right? You use, as it were, you use the arsenal at your disposal, and so in this way you have to think of cricket as a kind of an arsenal here, all right? All right, so I think that, these are some of the things that if we just go back to, I want to just go to this slide over here. So I think I've spoken about very briefly about cricket in the Caribbean, some of the problems that you have to think about. Cricket, as he says in the commentary there, cricket as a form of colonization, and the idea that Caribbean cricket had to send a message to the world that, we can't be taken for granted, we have to stand up, for our rights. And this is where, of course, there is a kind of a universal discourse of human rights, which had begun to emerge in the post-World War II period, and takes on a particular resonance when you look at black people. So that's why you have to really think of the missing part of this story is, although it's hinted at a little bit, is decolonization and anti-colonial movements in Africa itself. Most African countries acquired their independence in the 1960s, and in the Caribbean that was the case as well. Trinidad and Jamaica in the 1960s. Okay, and there is finally, if you go to the bottom of the slide here, this whole question of what Hegel had once described as the master-slave dialectic. They use that. So that's the last little clip that I'm going to show you, just about 10 seconds, and then from there we're going to move on to Lagaan. Okay, so let me just get to that last little bit here.
There was a lot that we had to overcome. We did not complain, and here we are, one of the greatest sporting teams in the history of team sport.
This is Andy Roberts. Of course, this is all 15, 20 years after.
To be around people who you had an enormous amount of respect for, and to be able to have done that with them was special, yeah.
He doesn't actually use much footage. So there's an independent question about, what's a real documentary style. He doesn't use much footage from the games. It's mainly interviews.
In one's life, especially with the struggles that one would have been through. It is history that you'll never forget.
That's what it was.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions about Babylon and Fire before I go back to Lagaan? Yes.
So one of the critiques that you were talking about was like no Indians in the movie and like inaccurate because the team was all black, which wasn't the actual case. So is there any, so like Lagaan, right?
Yeah.
It's made, it's homegrown, it's Indian made, but like this movie, right? It's British made. Right? It's made by a British filmmaker who's studying like West Indies. So like, is this like, can it be a thing where like there's a little case of objectivity because it's more like I mean it's like someone studying another person. So in the case of like insider versus outsider.
Yeah.
So is that why? Because they're trying to deny that indentured labor word.
Yeah, you would have noticed that there are some words that I'm scrupulous about avoiding. Objectivity is one of them. I don't myself believe that there is such a thing. I think that when you make a film, when you write a text, when you produce a work of art, you do it from a certain standpoint. All right? Your question is that, look, what is the politics? I want to rephrase the question so we can put it in an analytical frame. What is the politics of representation? Okay? How does one represent something? And in particular, how does one represent the other? Right? Here, the question has to do fundamentally with, it's not a question of whether the filmmaker is being objective or not. And of course, in some ways, it has nothing to do with objectivity because the filmmaker is quite explicit. That this is really an attempt to show you a certain perspective on Caribbean cricket. And suggest that cricket is not just a game, it's not just a sport. No sport is just a sport. There is always a politics to sports. Now the question